The sound of war drums echoed across the frozen valley like thunder trapped in ice. Thomas McKenna stood at his cabin window, watching the horizon darken with riders, 50, maybe more, their painted faces stark against the white snow. The winter wind carried their war cries, and every instinct screamed at him to bar the door, load his rifle, and prepare for his final stand. His weathered hands trembled as he gripped the windowsill. This was it. This was how a man who had survived 20 winters on the frontier would meet his end, surrounded, outnumbered, with nowhere to run. The drum beats grew louder, closer, like the heartbeat of death itself. But what happened next would silence the entire prairie. His back carried the weight of 2 decades on this unforgiving land, but his spirit remained unbroken. He checked his cattle, mended fences, and stoked the fire that would keep him alive through another bitter night. The silence of winter was his only companion, a silence so complete it seemed to muffle even his thoughts. He had chosen this isolation after losing his wife to fever 5 years ago, finding peace in the rhythm of solitary work. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles south, the town of Clearwater 20 miles east. Out here, a man learned to depend on himself and only himself. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered pasture, Thomas spotted something dark against the white expanse. A figure, small and still, half buried in a drift near his property line. His heart quickened as he grabbed his coat and trudged through the deep snow, his boots crunching with each labored step. What he found would test every principle he had ever lived by. A native woman, perhaps 40 years of age, lay unconscious in the snow, her dark hair frozen with ice crystals, her lips blue with cold. Her clothing, traditional beadwork now stiff with frost, told him she was Blackfoot. Her breathing came in shallow gasps, each exhale creating tiny clouds that dissipated quickly in the frigid air. Around her neck hung a silver cross, worn smooth by years of touch. Thomas knew the risks. Taking in a native woman, especially during these tense times when the territory balanced on the edge of war, could mark him as a traitor to his own kind. But looking at her face, peaceful even in unconsciousness, he saw only a human being in desperate need. He gathered her into his arms and carried her toward his cabin. But his kindness would soon summon something far greater than gratitude. The woman woke slowly by his fireplace, wrapped in his thickest blankets, her eyes focusing with the caution of someone accustomed to danger. She spoke little English, but through gestures and broken words, Thomas learned her name was Iana, meaning eternal blossom in her tongue. Her husband, a respected warrior, had died in a hunting accident 2 moons ago. She had been traveling to her sister's village when the blizzard struck, separating her from her escort. For 3 days, Thomas cared for her, sharing his meager winter stores and tending to her frost-bitten hands. She was quiet but watchful, her eyes holding dips of wisdom that spoke of both great loss and enduring strength. When she finally spoke his name, Thomas, it sounded like a prayer of gratitude. He found himself looking forward to her presence, the way she hummed softly while mending his torn shirts, the grace with which she moved despite her injuries. But on the morning of the 4th day, as he returned from checking his traps, he saw riders approaching his cabin, his neighbors from Clearwater, armed and angry. Frank Morrison led the group.
"McKenna, you fool! The whole territory's talking about you harboring a redskin squaw!" Behind him, 8 other men sat their horses with weapons visible, their breath steaming in the cold air like smoke from funeral pyres. "She needs to go, Thomas, today, before word reaches Fort Hamilton and they decide you're more enemy than neighbor." Thomas stepped between the men in his cabin door, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "She's hurt, Frank, half dead when I found her. No man turns away someone dying in the snow." Morrison's eyes narrowed, scanning the peaceful scene. Smoke rising from the chimney, Thomas's calm demeanor, the subtle evidence of a woman's presence. You don't understand, McKenna. Her husband was Standing Bear. He was Crowfeather's son. That makes her family to one of the most powerful war chiefs in Montana. They'll come looking for her, and when they do,
every white settlement for 100 miles will burn. Thomas felt his blood chill, but his resolve remained firm. Then they'll find her alive and well cared for, won't they? The men exchanged worried glances, and Morrison's voice dropped to a threatening whisper. "You're signing all our death warrants, you stubborn fool." As the riders departed, kicking up clouds of snow in their wake, Thomas realized the true weight of his choice. And in that silence, the land itself seemed to hold its breath. That evening, Ayanna approached Thomas as he sat by the fire, whittling a piece of wood with nervous energy. She had fashioned a crude map in the ashes of the hearth, showing the location of her people's winter camp. Through gestures and her limited English, she made it clear she needed to return before they came searching. "They look for me," she said, her voice soft but urgent. "Many horses, many weapons." Thomas looked at her face, illuminated by firelight, and saw the conflict there, gratitude warring with duty, safety battling with honor. "If I take you back," he said slowly, "they'll think I kidnapped you, held you against your will. They'll kill me before you can explain." Ayanna's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. She reached for the silver cross around her neck, the one that had caught his attention in the snow. With careful movements, she removed it and placed it in his weathered palm. The metal was warm from her skin, and Thomas could see it was intricately engraved, not just any cross, but something precious, meaningful. "My mother," Ayanna whispered, "mission school. She believed both ways, your way, our way." She pressed his fingers closed around the cross. "You keep. When they come, you show. They understand." Thomas stared at the cross, feeling the weight of much more than silver. This wasn't just jewelry. It was a bridge between two worlds, a testament to faith that transcended cultural boundaries. But would it be enough to save his life when 50 warriors surrounded his cabin? Outside, the wind began to howl with a sound that seemed almost like voices crying across the winter landscape. Dawn broke gray and ominous, the sky heavy with clouds that promised more snow. Thomas had barely slept, his mind churning through every possible outcome of the choice he had made. As he prepared breakfast, Ayanna sat quietly by the window, her posture tense with listening. "They come today," she said with certainty that chilled him more than the winter air. "I feel them." By mid-morning, the first sounds reached them, distant but unmistakable. Horses moving through snow, many horses, accompanied by the rhythmic beat of war drums that seemed to make the very walls of the cabin tremble. Thomas checked his rifle, though he knew it would be useless against so many. Ayanna rose from her seat and moved to stand beside him, her hand gently touching his arm. "You good man, Thomas, no fear." But fear was exactly what he felt as the sounds grew closer, more distinct. War cries carried on the wind, the jingle of weapons and bridles, the thunder of hoofbeats that seemed to shake the earth itself. Thomas had faced down rustlers, survived blizzards, and buried the woman he loved, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. Through the window, he watched them appear on the ridge, a line of warriors that seemed to stretch across the entire horizon, their war paint stark against their dark skin, their weapons glinting in the pale sunlight. At their head rode a man whose very presence commanded attention, tall, proud, with eagle feathers in his hair, and a face marked by both wisdom and barely controlled rage. This could only be Crow Feather himself. The warriors descended the slope with deliberate slowness, forming a perfect circle around Thomas's cabin. Their horses snorted and stamped, but the men sat perfectly still, weapons ready but not yet raised. The war drums had fallen silent, creating a quiet so intense it seemed to press against Thomas's eardrums. Crow Feather rode forward alone, stopping just 20 feet from the cabin door. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. "White man who holds my daughter, come out, face what you have done." Thomas felt Ayana's hand squeeze his arm once, gently, before she stepped back. He opened the cabin door and walked out into the snow, his hands visible and empty, the silver cross hidden in his pocket like a last desperate prayer. Crow Feather's eyes were like winter itself, cold, unforgiving, capable of bringing death with a single word. "You take what is not yours," the chief said, his English precise despite the accent. "You steal from people who have lost too much already." The circle of warriors tightened imperceptibly, their weapons now clearly visible, rifles, bows, war clubs, all pointed toward the solitary figure of Thomas McKenna. "I didn't steal anything," Thomas said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I found her dying in the snow and gave her shelter, nothing more." Crow Feather's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, perhaps surprise at the white man's calm tone or anger at what he perceived as lies. "You speak truth?" Crow Feather asked, his voice carrying the weight of absolute judgment. "You ask me to believe the man who takes my son's widow seeks nothing in return." Thomas reached slowly into his pocket, his movements deliberate and careful. Every warrior in the circle tensed, weapons rising slightly, ready to cut him down at the first sign of threat. But instead of a weapon, Thomas withdrew the silver cross, holding it up so the pale sunlight caught its engraved surface. "She gave me this," he said simply, "said you would understand." The effect was immediate and profound. Crow Feather's eyes widened, and he swung down from his horse with fluid grace. As he approached, Thomas could see the intricate details of the cross, not just Christian symbols, but tiny beadwork designs worked into the silver, a perfect fusion of two faiths. "Where'd you find this?" Crow Feather asked, his voice now urgent rather than threatening. "Around her neck when I pulled her from the snow," Thomas replied. "She said her mother believed in both ways." Crow Feather took the cross with hands that trembled slightly, turning it over to reveal an inscription on the back, words in the Blackfoot language that Thomas couldn't read, but whose meaning was clearly profound. "Sacred Heart," Crow Feather whispered, using the English words with reverence. "My wife's mother. She was first of our people to learn the white man's prayers, but she never forgot the old ways. This was her sacred trust, passed to my wife, and then to," his voice broke slightly, "to the daughter I thought I had lost forever." At that moment, the cabin door opened, and Ayana stepped out into the snow. She walked slowly toward her father, for now Thomas understood the relationship, her movements graceful despite her recent ordeal. When she reached Crow Feather, she knelt in the snow and spoke rapidly in their native tongue. Thomas couldn't understand the words, but he could read the emotion, gratitude, respect, and something that sounded almost like pleading. Crow Feather listened intently, his eyes never leaving his daughter's face. When she finished speaking, he helped her to her feet and turned back to Thomas with an expression completely transformed. "She tells me of your kindness, how you shared your food when you had little, how you tended her frozen hands with the gentleness of a father, how you gave her your own blankets and slept by the fire to keep her warm." The chief's voice carried a note of wonder, as if such selfless behavior from a white man was beyond his experience. "She tells me also that your neighbors came with guns." demanding you cast her out into the snow to die, and you refused. Thomas felt the weight of 50 pairs of eyes upon him, all calculating, all reassessing the man they had come to kill. Any decent person would have done the same, he said quietly. She needed help. That's all that mattered. Crow Feather studied Thomas's face for a long moment, as if trying to peer into his very soul. You speak truth, he said finally, but you do not understand the full truth of what you have done. Crow Feather raised the silver cross above his head, and immediately every warrior in the circle dismounted from his horse. What happened next took Thomas's breath away. One by one, beginning with the youngest warrior and ending with the gray-haired elders, each man knelt in the snow, bowing his head toward the white rancher who had saved their chief's daughter. The sight was so unexpected, so powerful, that Thomas felt tears sting his eyes. You have returned to me the last gift of my beloved wife, Crow Feather said, his own voice thick with emotion. Ayanna carries not just my blood, but the sacred trust of her grandmama, the bridge between the old wisdom and the new faith. To save her life is to preserve the memory of all the women who came before. The chief placed his hand on Thomas's shoulder with the solemnity of a sacred oath. From this day, you are under the protection of the Blackfoot Nation. Any who harm you harm us. Any who threaten your land threaten our honor. Your cattle will drink from our streams, your horses will graze in our valleys, and your children, should the spirits bless you with them, will grow up in safety. Thomas looked around at the kneeling warriors, at Ayanna's tear-streaked face, at the silver cross gleaming in the winter sunlight, and felt a profound shift in his understanding of what it meant to be human in this vast, unforgiven territory. As the warriors rose and began to mount their horses, Crow Feather made one final gesture. He called forward a young brave, leading a magnificent stallion, black as midnight with white markings like lightning across its flanks. "This is Thunderwalker," the chief said, presenting the reins to Thomas. "He was my son's war horse, bred from the finest bloodlines of our people. He has no master now, but he will serve the man who saved Standing Bear's wife." Thomas accepted the reins with hands that shook slightly, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the gift. The stallion was clearly worth more than everything he owned, a creature of such beauty and power that owning it would mark him as a man of great standing among both Indians and whites. "I can't accept this," Thomas began, but Crow Feather silenced him with a gesture. "You can and you will. To refuse would dishonor my son's memory and my daughter's debt." As the warriors prepared to depart, Ayanna approached Thomas one final time. She had fashioned a small pouch from beaded leather, filled with what looked like herbs and small sacred objects. "Medicine bundle," she said in careful English. "For protection, for healing, you keep always." She tied it around his neck with gentle hands, and Thomas could smell the sweet scent of sage and sweetgrass. "Thank you," he whispered, inadequate words for what she had given him. Not just the bundle, but the transformation of his entire understanding of courage, kindness, and connection. As the Blackfoot riders crested the ridge and disappeared into the gray afternoon, Thomas stood in his dooryard, holding the reins of Thunderwalker, the medicine bundle warm against his chest, the silver cross heavy in his pocket. The silence that had been his companion for so many years felt different now, not empty, but full of possibility. He had learned that mercy could indeed be the greatest form of courage, that sometimes the smallest act of human kindness could bridge the deepest cultural divides. In the distance, he could see riders approaching from the direction of Clearwater, no doubt his neighbors coming to see if he had survived the encounter. Frank Morrison and the others would find him very much alive, protected by forces they had never bothered to understand or respect. Thomas smiled as he led Thunderwalker toward the barn. He had a feeling that life on the frontier was about to become very different indeed. The stories would spread, how a stubborn rancher's act of simple human decency had forged an alliance that would change the territory forever. But more than that, Thomas had learned something about himself, about the kind of man he wanted to be in this hard land, where survival often seemed to require the sacrifice of one's humanity. Years later, when settlers spoke of the peace that had settled over the Montana Territory, they would remember this winter day when a white man's refusal to abandon a native woman in the snow had proven that honor and compassion could triumph over fear and prejudice. Thomas McKenna's name would be spoken with respect in both Blackfoot lodges and frontier cabins, a bridge between worlds that had seemed forever divided. The alliance forged in snow and sealed with sacred silver would endure long after both men had joined the spirits of the land they had learned to share. Sometimes the most powerful changes begin with the simplest choices. The choice to see another's humanity even when the world tells you they are your enemy. The choice to offer shelter even when it might cost you everything. The choice to believe that mercy can be stronger than fear. Would you have risked everything for a stranger's life? Tell us in the comments what you would have done in Thomas's place. And remember to subscribe for more powerful stories of courage that changed the American frontier. Click on the video on the screen to watch our next story about a preacher who defied an entire town to save a condemned man, with a twist so powerful you'll question everything you thought you knew about justice.